Okay. Taft is going to have his own brand of. Well, actually, we're not ready to have Taft as a president yet, though. Taft. What is Taft in relationship to the Philippines? He's the governor, right? He ends up being the governor of the Philippines, and there's a lot of people who say that it was awful, this civilizing them, right? And some people say maybe he helped bring education around, maybe he helped get rid of some disease. Either way, he was the governor. And the point behind this is we want to expand into China. And this is going to be part of our open door policy. John Hay was the Secretary of State, all right? The Secretary of State was John Hay, and what he did, and let me fast forward this. We'll get, I'll come back in a minute. Come on, you can do it. All right, you can sort of see, can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Okay, and you can see how important in terms of strategic, here's Hawaii, here are the Philippines. We also got American Samoa after the war. But here's Guam and Philippines. We now have a stepping stone to China. You see that? And you can also see the importance of Alfred Mahan, right? The influence of sea power upon history. We obviously talked about America wanting to spread our civilization. England called it the white man's burden, right? This racist idea. Did you learn about this last year in AP World?
Yeah.
The racist idea that it was the duty of Caucasians to spread their civilization around the world. And that's why a lot of Democrats who were anti-imperialist didn't think it was a white man's burden, because they were scared of racial intermingling. So there's racism on both sides. Obviously, there is some religious interest. Is religion sometimes used as a way to imperialize? The Spanish used this for 300 years. Right. I mean, imagine that. The Catholics were using religion to imperialize.
Are they seriously writing people?
Yeah.
Wow.
They're writing people now. Well, as a kid, they all have their own people. Now, what does this say about how these white people saw indigenous Filipinos or Chinese people?
They're like animals.
They are literally below them.
Literally.
Right? Literally below them.
Yeah.
They do not see them as equal, and not even close to being as equal. This is the mindset you have to put yourself in terms of a willingness to be imperialistic. If you see someone as not equal to you, in fact, so much further below you, then you don't have a hard time justifying aggression, right? It's the same thing with the Native Americans, right? They weren't seen as being equal, therefore what they could do or be done to them was pretty brutal. If you start seeing somebody as equal, now what you're doing is brutality, right? But if you can convince yourself they're not equal, think slavery, right? Then what you're doing is almost natural, right? It's morally justifiable. It's paternalism, right? We talked about this before in terms of closing off the American frontier. This shows you some of the battles. The Battle of Wounded Knee is the last one that helped close off the frontier, which pushes America towards this. Obviously, what we're going to start seeing is a lot of cartoons that are built on racist ideas. A lot of Hawaiians and people of darker skin were lampooned in these cartoons as being kind of dumb. There is the Queen, and we talked about what was the reason why we wanted to annex Hawaii. In the end, what was the big reason? Why did Dole want to take over? Yeah, it was financial, right? It was economic because of tariffs. And we talked about tariffs. They're saying for Dole with a pretty wicked beard.
Wow.
Split down the middle. Right? No one grows them like that anymore. And if you do grow them like that, then you're considered to be weird all of a sudden. No one normal grows that beard. And took over. Here is everyone's favorite thing with Japan, where Commodore Perry goes into Japan with his gunboats and just says, "We're here, you're going to trade with us, or we will shoot at you." We'll get to the gentleman's agreement a little bit later. Okay, here are some cartoons. Who is this right here? No, this is Taft. This is McKinley. Who is this? This is Uncle Sam, right? And you can see rational expansion, foreign policy, enlightenment. These are the things that they're building this on. And I don't know if you can notice it, but you can see all the different places that America is expanding into. Puerto Rico, Hawaii, even California, Alaska, Florida, all the places that are expanding. And why is he fat?
Because he's got new territory.
Because he's getting new territories, right? I told you about the reconcentration camps and how there were some similarities in terms of what people look like. With the Cubans being tortured by the Spanish rule and generally Simo Weiler, the butcher Weiler. You can see, I mean, doesn't this kind of look like some of the concentration camp photos we saw from, you've seen as children from Nazism?
Slaves too.
So there is some, and you can see we talked about yellow journalists trying to build the argument for war, right? These guys know that there's just tons and tons and tons of money in the business of war. This is a Delome letter we talked about. This is Delome, critical of McKinley, taken by the Yellow Press, put in. Look at this quote. McKinley has the backbone of a chocolate eclair.
That sounds like something Roosevelt's.
Yeah. Here's some photos of Spain, the Spanish American War. The war only lasted a couple months. It was called the Splendid Little War. We talked about the Philippines. Here's a cartoon. Who is this? Who is this?
Caesar.
Caesar. And so what's going on here?
God gave him to
Well, do we become? Do you see how this guy's been racially archetyped down here in the Filipino? Do Americans make the decision to become despotic like these leaders? Remember, America was built on the idea of not being colonial, right? Theoretically. Getting away from the really, really powerful European powers. But what are we doing now? We're acting like one, right? So maybe we're arguing that we're mature like a European, or maybe we're moving. There's Emilio Aguinaldo. We talked about how cool his name was. And they did get their independence finally in 1946, which we're going to talk about in a second. Taft was, there's the big boy right there. Taft was very, very efficient. Remember I said this before when he was president during the Progressive Era? He wasn't considered to be a really, I want to say a big figure, because obviously he was a pretty big figure. But he didn't have a gigantic personality, right? He was a very, very efficient administrator. He processed stuff quickly, not a lot of red tape. Many say he helped out the Philippines, others say, he is just an example of American imperialism. And then obviously, who is this eagle? It's America, and our shadow is being cast across the globe now, right? And by our shadow, what are we talking about? Our sphere of influence. Good. Okay, we talked about Cuba being free, Puerto Rico, Guam. We've already talked about the Anti-Imperialist League. We talked about the Teller versus the Platt Amendment. The United States would allow for freedom, but we could intervene if necessary to establish an efficient, independent government. So is that total independence?
No.
No. So it's sort of independence. And we get Guantanamo. We talked about the insular cases that the Rice did not follow the flag. The Jones Act, actually, there were two Jones Acts. One was the Jones Act. You don't write this down. I don't know if it's on your notes or not. One was the Jones Act of 1916. One was the Jones Act of 1917. The 1916 Jones Act said the Philippines would receive their independence 30 years from then, which actually they did. And the 1917 Jones Act gave territorial status to Puerto Rico. It took tariffs off of Puerto Rico. Do what?
Were they upset about becoming a territory instead of gaining independence?
I don't know if about Puerto Rican independence movements to know. I know that for a long time they didn't want to be part of America in terms of the state. And just recently they did have a referendum where they have decided with a little bit of a majority that they'd like to become a state. So that's actually relatively new. Roadie road. All right, Panama is what I want to talk about. And well, hold on. Let's. There we go. All right. We talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I want to talk about the Boxer Rebellion and the open door policy. Actually, I'm finally here. All right. Here is China, right? Here is China, and you can see the countries all have a pretty, like, here is France has a huge, not controlled politically, but has, do what? Not controlled politically, but has a really strong economic presence. And France has a big one. You can see Germany's up here. You can see Britain's here and here. Russia has some, especially with rights to a railroad to get to the sea. And America wants in. And John Hay sends all these countries a letter that becomes known as the Open Door Letter. And he essentially says, you know, I think that we should all have equal access to Chinese markets. We would not be in control of China. We would just have access to Chinese markets. And the funny part about it is, if you're Britain or France or Germany, you're already here, and this guy sends this to you, what are you going to say to him? Yeah, what are you talking about? Are you kidding me? You want us to share just because you think it'd be sweet? This isn't how international politics works. So he was basically told no. Well, what John Hay does is just sort of ignore what they said and issue the open door policy, that we are all sharing China as a market. Who was not asked about this?
China.
China wasn't asked about this. And in reaction, some Chinese started to form a rebellion in response.
Is this the one where the great imperial army of 8 different people?
Yes.
Well, yeah, the Boxers were a nationalistic group who were fighting for their sovereign. I forget her name, but they were trying to remove the European and American powers, right, who were coming in economically and religiously, putting up missionaries and stuff. They were called the Boxers because of the way they looked when they would do, like, martial arts. They also believed that if they put themselves in a spiritual state, that bullets wouldn't hit them. They would bounce right off. This, as it turned out, not to be the case. And during fighting, the Boxers actually had some missionaries surrounded. There's some actually pretty interesting primary evidence about this. And eventually the Boxer Rebellion is crushed, and the Americans and the European powers sort of divide up in terms of trade. Although America did establish some sort of diplomatic relationship as sort of a peace offering with the Chinese. We'll send you some students and whatnot. But in the end, this was how we got into China. And that brings us to Roosevelt. And when Roosevelt's elected, one of the things that he's going to want to focus on is Panama. I already passed Panama. Yeah. Okay. Panama, there had tried to be a canal forever. In fact, for a long time they wanted to go through Nicaragua. In fact, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which you remember before with England in 1842, part of that was allowing that no one had total rights over Nicaragua. Nicaragua actually had a larger landmass to go through. It was actually flatter and a little bit easier to get through. The Isthmus of Panama was really thin, but it was harder and mountainous and jungly, and it was tough going. Finally, in 1903, Benoît Varea was a minister of France. He signed a treaty with John Hay, that's the Hay in this, and gave America the rights to a small amount of land that would later become the Panama Canal. In fact, we would run the Panama Canal, and he would have to pay us money to do it up until 1999. We turned it over to the Panamanians, which is a fun word to say, in the year 2000.
Is it really Panamanians?
I think so. I know. It's like if you're from Michigan, you're a Michanigan. Michanigan. I think it's a ridiculous name, but it's real.
I met a Panamanian works on the Panama.
Okay, so you can see here. There's Roosevelt operating a giant machine. Roosevelt. This was one of the great industrial. This is one of the great engineering and industrial feats of all time. The first couple of years, it took them. They were literally clearing and killing all the bugs. Because when the French and the British tried to do this, malaria just wiped everyone out. And so the first thing that Americans had to do was clean the place out. And it's like it's trying to make a jungle dry. Killing all the mosquitoes in a tropical jungle.
That's easy.
Yeah.
Right. And then you're talking about moving massive amounts of land. I'm going to show you this thing on YouTube where it goes through the Panama Canal. It's really cool. And it took almost 10 years. And it was considered a real feat of engineering. I think it opened up in 1913. And when they interviewed Roosevelt about it, he ended up saying, I took the canal. At first it was like, he's doing this for the world, but it kind of comes out that Roosevelt was like, yeah, I did this because this is what I wanted. And you can see it go through here. Now the question is, and the problem was, Panama was owned by Colombia. It literally wasn't its own country. So how is it that we get Panama to build this canal? Because Colombians were like, we don't want you to build this. And Roosevelt, using glorious Roosevelt fashion, came up with an idea that was nicknamed gunboat diplomacy. Where literally, we put, like, there literally is still, I just used the word literally about 7 times in a sentence. There is still no road that just goes all the way through this jungle down. It's still jungle here. It's very impassable in terms of large armies. So what we did was we helped start a revolution in Panama. We put a bunch of gunboats on the outside of each one, and we told Colombia that if they crushed the Panamanian Revolution, we're gonna shoot at them. And remember how the American Revolution lasted like 8 years? Panamanian Revolution, I think my dates are right. I think it started on November 1st or 2nd, and I think the treaty was signed on November 4th.
Wow.
That's awesome.
It did not take long. We just basically took it. Banu Berea, the guy who we signed the treaty with, became one of the leaders of the newly formed Panama, and now we've got this land that's been given to us by helping the Panamanians get their independence by putting a bunch of gunboats. It's sort of like the mafia. Have you ever heard the term, I gave him an offer he can't refuse? What's that mean? Yeah, I put a gun to your head and I say, sign this or I'm going to shoot you. And so what does everybody do?
Sign it.
They sign it. I gave him an offer he couldn't refuse. That's kind of what Roosevelt did in this case. And what this is going to turn into is his foreign policy is going to end up becoming something called big stick diplomacy. There is the he adds a corollary or an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. It ends up knowing as the Roosevelt Corollary. And this is part of his overall theme of big stick diplomacy. By the way, in the past I have messed up the word stick and said something else, and it comes out way different than I want it to come out. But Roosevelt Corollary, remember the Monroe Doctrine said no new colonization, right? If you're here, you can stay. That was in 1823. Now what we're saying is, we are the policemen of the Western Hemisphere. If you want to talk to any of these countries, you go through us first. This is our hemisphere. And any country that we want to intervene in, we'll intervene in. And America starts intervening in Cuba and Nicaragua and Dominican Republic, Mexico 11 times. Venezuela. We start intervening when we don't like what's going on in a country. So this is the addition, and the big stick diplomacy is part of his. You walk silently and carry a big stick. That is a really bad paraphrase of an African proverb, right? If to survive, or carry a big stick and walk softly, and you'll go far. He wants America to have power, imperial power, and part of that is the Navy. Is the Great White Fleet on there?
No.
the Venezuela crisis, you guys know where Venezuela is, right? Northern South America. And the Venezuela crisis, Roosevelt is going to use his power and use his influence to show the power of America now, the new power. Where am I? Yeah. There was a dispute between Venezuela and Germany sank two American ships. Germany sank two Venezuelan ships. Venezuela owed Germany money. Venezuela also owed Britain money. And they said, we're going to come and get it from Venezuela. And Roosevelt said, you're not going to come into our neighborhood. You're not coming into our hemisphere. We will pay you and we'll get the money from Venezuela, but you don't come here without our permission. Think about what this means in terms of, think about what America did. How scared were European nations of America 20 years before this? Not at all. Now, we're telling Germany and England to stay out of our neighborhood or else. This is a huge flexing of the muscles. And one thing that America has always had going for us is a gigantic ocean in between us and Europe, right? It's easier to talk big when you know they have to bring over all their troops. This big stick diplomacy, though, how do you think it was seen by Latin American countries? No, it was nicknamed the bad neighbor policy. Because we'd intervene whenever we wanted to. We were now the bully on the block. And they saw it as the bad neighbor policy. This will later be undone by the good neighbor policy. I want to show one thing Roosevelt did, and if I can find that. Yeah. This is a picture of the Great White Fleet. Remember I said that we went from having like the 18th biggest Navy to like the second biggest Navy? When we got the second biggest Navy, we sent, and they were painted white, we sent our gunboats and our battleships all over the world and sat outside the port of most major cities so everyone in those countries could see our ships. It was a gigantic propaganda / don't blank with us. We're here on the stage now.
We did that with China a few years ago. We just sent an aircraft carrier.
Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, China knows how many boats we have. Yeah. It's not a secret. And we also, our Pacific Fleet, when we are concerned, we move our Pacific Fleet to a forward operation. Yeah. It's not like we go around the world and shoot stuff just so right now. We have a lot of aircraft carrier groups, and we push them, especially when there's issues with like Taiwan.
Yeah, that's what it was.
But here are some pictures of the Great White Fleet. How much racial stuff is in that too, right?
Yeah.
The Great White Fleet.
No African Americans allowed.
So, last thing I want to talk about is the Russo-Japanese War before we review. The Russo-Japanese War was the first time, it was 1904, Japan and Russia were fighting in a horrible war. And we were trying to help end it. Both places had, let's see if I can find this. Both places were losing lots of money. In fact, the Japanese were starting to tax their people a lot to pay for this. Where are we at? There we go. They were going to tax their people, so finally, Roosevelt had the Russians over, and Roosevelt had the Japanese over. And it was really weird. If you ever read about this, it's great. Each one was outside the port of Portsmouth, and each one had their own little boat, like a little Japanese ship where all the people were, a little Russian ship. And the Americans were on shore. And every breakfast, lunch, and dinner was a new, diplomatic time. And so one would host breakfast, and one would host lunch, and one would host dinner. And they would switch all the time, and they would talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And the big thing they were worried about was something called the Falkland Islands. The Falkland Islands are right here. And today even, does anyone remember there was a Russian foreign exchange student here last year?
Yeah.
Yeah, she was from the Falkland Islands, actually.
Yeah.
And Japan wanted them, and so did so did Russia. And in the end, it's split, and Japan takes the victory. And it's the first time that a non-white nation had beaten a European/white nation since like Byzantium or something, like 400 or 500 years. Russians were furious about this. They had to give in. This is the beginning of the end for the Tsar. And the Treaty of Portsmouth, it was called the Root-Takehara Agreement. The Treaty of Portsmouth ends up getting, ironically, Teddy Roosevelt a Nobel Peace Prize. The most aggressive imperialist we had got a Nobel Peace Prize. How great is that?
It's paying off to be aggressive.
Okay, yeah, the Treaty of Portsmouth ends this war, and this moves us to the next thing I want to talk about, which was in San Francisco, which is not up here. In San Francisco, there were a lot of Asians, especially a lot of Japanese who were in San Francisco and who were immigrating there. Many of them were immigrating there because the taxes on the Japanese got so high during the Russo-Japanese War, they were just moving. And in San Francisco, the people of San Francisco didn't want their kids going to school with the Japanese kids. Oh dear.